The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Hangang Park as Lee Hyun-woo walked beside Minji Park, his fiancée of 6 months. She spoke animatedly about flower arrangements and seating charts, her voice a pleasant hum he'd trained himself to tolerate. The engagement ring on her finger, a flawless 2-carat diamond set in platinum, represented everything their union was built upon: strategic advantage, territorial expansion, mutual protection. What it didn't represent, what it had never been designed to represent, was love. Hyun-woo nodded at appropriate intervals, his mind elsewhere, calculating shipment routes and payment schedules. This was his existence now, a carefully constructed performance of normalcy draped over a foundation of violence and control. At 32, he'd climbed to the position of his family's chief enforcer, a role that required equal parts ruthlessness and restraint. He wore his tailored suit like armor, his reputation like a shield. Nothing surprised him anymore. Nothing moved him. Until he saw her. The woman sat on a park bench ahead, her profile illuminated by slanting golden light. 3 toddlers surrounded her, 2 boys on the bench, 1 in her arms, all dressed in matching navy overalls. Time collapsed. His chest constricted. The world reduced itself to a single, impossible truth. If you value the hard work behind these stories, hitting that subscribe button would mean so much to me. Also, before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's continue. Naomi. 3 years had passed since he'd last seen her face, since he'd spoken words designed to destroy what they'd built together. But time had done nothing to erase the memory of her laugh, the curve of her smile, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone worth saving. Now, watching her wipe a smudge from one child's cheek, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The boys had his eyes, dark and slightly upturned at the corners. They had his nose, his mouth, his serious expression when concentrating on the toys in their hands. The mathematics was simple and devastating. 3 children. 3 years since he'd walked away. 3 pieces of his soul sitting on a bench 20 meters away, living proof that some mistakes don't stay buried. Minji's voice faded into white noise. The carefully maintained walls he'd built around his heart developed cracks, then fissures, then collapsed entirely. Because one of the boys looked up, caught his stare, and for a heartbeat, Hyun-woo was looking at a mirror reflection of his own childhood face. His father had kept that photograph on his desk. A 3-year-old boy with 2 serious eyes, already learning that emotions were weaknesses and love was a liability. He'd convinced himself that pushing Naomi away was an act of protection. He'd told himself that a woman like her, bright, optimistic, untouched by the corruption that defined his world, deserved better than life sentences and funeral processions. He'd believed that cruelty in the short term was kindness in the long term. But standing here, watching her exist in a reality he'd forced her into alone, Hyun-woo understood with crushing clarity that he hadn't protected her at all. He'd simply been a coward dressed in the costume of a martyr. And now his cowardice had names, faces, and his own eyes staring back at him from a park bench in Seoul. Hyun-woo stood frozen as Minji tugged at his sleeve, asking if he was listening. He wasn't. Every cell in his body was focused on the woman 20 meters away, on the impossible mathematics of the children surrounding her. 3 years ago, he'd walked away from Naomi Wells with words calculated to destroy any possibility of reconciliation. He'd called their relationship a temporary amusement, her feelings a naive misunderstanding. He'd watched her face crumble, watched her pack her apartment with shaking hands, watched her book a flight back to Chicago with tears streaming down her face that she'd angrily wiped away whenever she caught him looking. He'd told himself it was necessary. His father had just ordered the execution of a rival's entire family, including a 6-year-old daughter, to make a point about territorial boundaries. Hyun-woo had carried out the order because that's what sons did in his world. They obeyed. They proved loyalty with blood. And afterward, looking at Naomi sleeping peacefully beside him, he'd understood with terrifying clarity that anyone he loved became a target, a weakness, a weapon that could be used against him. So he destroyed what they had before someone else could. He'd chosen her life over her heart. At least, that's the story he'd been telling himself for 3 years. Now, Minji followed his gaze and frowned. Do you know that woman? Her tone carried suspicion. Minji wasn't stupid, and in their world, unexpected connections were always dangerous. No, Hyun-woo lied automatically. I thought she was someone else. But he couldn't look away. One of the boys, the one on the left, had started crying, and Naomi pulled him close, whispering something that made him calm immediately. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, wiping his face, checking his brother's juice cup, adjusting the third child's position on her hip. The exhaustion in her movements was profound. This wasn't someone playing at parenthood. This was survival. "We should go," Minji said, her hand tightening on his arm. "Your father is expecting us for dinner." Hyun-woo forced himself to nod, to turn, to walk away. But he looked back once, and that's when the child in Naomi's arms looked directly at him. Their eyes met, the same unusual dark brown that Hyun-woo saw every morning in the mirror. The same serious, evaluating expression. The same slight tilt of the head when processing new information. His son. His children. His genetic legacy wrapped in the body of a toddler who would never know him. That evening, Hyun-woo sat through dinner with his father and future in-laws, nodding at appropriate moments, making necessary commitments about territory and tribute. But his mind was elsewhere, calculating timelines and probabilities. If Naomi was in Seoul with 3 children who looked exactly like him, she hadn't gone back to Chicago. She'd stayed in Korea, which meant she'd been here, in his city, raising his children alone for 3 years while he'd been planning a strategic marriage and consolidating power. After dinner, Hyun-woo drove to his office in Gangnam, a legitimate import-export business that served as cover for less legal operations. His second-in-command, Park Jin-ho, was already waiting, having learned decades ago that when Hyun-woo called after midnight, the matter was urgent. "I need you to find someone," Hyun-woo said, sliding a photograph across the desk. He'd taken it surreptitiously at the park, a skill developed through years of surveillance work. "Naomi Wells. American. She has 3 children. I need to know where she lives, where she works, what her immigration status is, everything." Jin-ho studied the photo without comment. In their line of work, you didn't ask questions about motivation. You delivered information and let others make decisions. "How quickly?" "By morning." Jin-ho nodded and left. Hyun-woo remained in his office, staring at the photograph, trying to reconcile the exhausted woman in the park with the vibrant, laughing person he'd known 3 years ago. Naomi had come to Seoul on a university exchange program, studying international business, fascinated by Korean culture, optimistic about building bridges between different worlds. She'd approached him at a campus coffee shop, asked in terrible Korean if the seat was taken, then switched to English with an embarrassed laugh when he'd responded in perfect English. She'd been light where he was darkness. She'd believed people were fundamentally good, that systems could be reformed, that love was enough. He'd been fascinated by her naivety, attracted to the possibility that maybe she was right, that maybe he could be someone other than his father's weapon. For 6 months, he'd lived a double life, brutal enforcer by day, devoted boyfriend by night. She'd known he came from money, that his family business was complicated, but she hadn't known the specifics. He'd protected her from that knowledge the way you'd protect a child from nightmares. Until the night his father had ordered him to murder a family, and Hyun-woo realized that nightmares don't stay compartmentalized. They bleed into everything. So he'd ended it with words designed to make her hate him, to make leaving easy, to ensure she'd never look back. Apparently, she'd looked back enough to stay in Korea and raise his children. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, Hyun-woo felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose unconnected to duty or obligation. Those children existed because of him. They deserved better than an absent father who'd chosen cowardice over courage. And if he'd learned anything from his violent life, it was this. Some mistakes could be corrected, but only if you were willing to pay the price. Whatever that price was, Hyun-woo was ready to pay it. Jin-ho arrived at dawn with a folder thick enough to tell a story Hyun-woo wasn't prepared to hear. Naomi had stayed in Seoul on a student visa extension, then transitioned to a work visa teaching English at a private academy. She'd given birth to the triplets at Seoul National University Hospital, the same hospital where Hyun-woo's mother had died giving birth to his stillborn sister. She'd listed the father as unknown on the birth certificates, a detail that felt like both mercy and accusation. 2 years ago, she'd left the academy and started a small catering business operating out of a shared commercial kitchen in Itaewon. The business barely broke even. Her apartment was in a building slated for redevelopment, and the landlord was pressuring tenants to leave early. She had $13,000 in debt, mostly medical bills from the complicated delivery. Her visa was up for renewal in 4 months, and given her financial instability, renewal was uncertain. "There's more," Jin-ho said, his tone carefully neutral. Immigration Services opened an investigation 3 weeks ago. Anonymous complaints about unauthorized work and inability to properly provide for the children. Hyun-woo looked up sharply. Who filed the complaints? The source is protected, but the timing is interesting. It coincides with your engagement announcement in the Korean business press. The implication was clear. Someone in his family had discovered Naomi's existence and decided to resolve the problem quietly. Force her out of the country, eliminate the complication, preserve the family's reputation and the strategic marriage. It was exactly the kind of elegant, brutal solution his father favored. No direct violence, just systematic destruction of someone's entire life. Where is she now? Hyun-woo asked. The commercial kitchen. She has a catering job this afternoon. Hyun-woo was out the door before Jin-ho finished speaking. He drove through morning traffic with single-minded focus, the city sliding past like a film he wasn't watching. Itaewon's International District was just waking up, hookah bars and international restaurants preparing for the day, American military personnel jogging in formation, street vendors setting up their carts. The commercial kitchen was in a basement space, accessible through a narrow alley. Hyun-woo found Naomi surrounded by industrial equipment, her hair tied back, hands moving efficiently through the preparation of what looked like hundreds of gimbap rolls. The children sat in a corner on blankets, playing with blocks under the watchful eye of an elderly Korean woman who'd clearly been hired as temporary help. Naomi looked up at the sound of his footsteps and went completely still. The knife in her hand clattered against the cutting board. For a long moment, neither spoke. The children, sensing tension, stopped playing and watched. "You need to leave," Naomi finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "I have work to do. We need to talk. We talked 3 years ago. I believe your exact words were that I was a temporary distraction and you'd grown bored. So I'll make this simple. I'm still boring, and you're still not interested. Goodbye." She turned back to her work, but her hands were shaking. Hyun-woo could see the exhaustion carved into her face, the weight she'd lost, the strength it was taking for her to remain standing. He glanced at the children, his children, and felt something crack open in his chest. "They're mine," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement of truth that couldn't be avoided any longer. Naomi's shoulders stiffened. "They're mine. You made your choice. These are the consequences you walked away from. I didn't know. Would it have mattered?" She spun to face him, and there it was, the accumulated rage and hurt of 3 years. "You threw me away like garbage. You looked me in the eye and told me I meant nothing. So no, you don't get to come back now with some redemption story. You don't get to play father because you saw us in a park and felt guilty." The elderly woman had gathered the children and was quietly ushering them toward a back room, giving them privacy. Hyun-woo watched his sons go. Identical faces, identical confusion, identical wariness around this stranger who'd made their mother upset. "I know what I said," Hyun-woo replied, keeping his voice level. "I know what I did. But those children deserve better than this." He gestured at the cramped kitchen, the precarious situation, the visible evidence of struggle. "These children deserve better than you," Naomi shot back. "They deserve better than whatever you are. Probably. But I'm what they have. And right now, you're facing an immigration investigation that's going to end with deportation. The complaints were filed by someone in my family. This is because of me. Let me fix it." Naomi laughed, a broken sound. "Fix it? You think this is something that can be fixed? I spent 3 years learning how to be a single mother in a country where I barely spoke the language. I've worked jobs that paid nothing, lived in apartments with mold problems, gone without food so they could eat. And you want to fix it?" "Yes." The simple certainty in his voice seemed to derail her anger. She stared at him, searching for something, sincerity, maybe, or proof that this wasn't another manipulation. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Why does it matter now when it didn't matter 3 years ago?" "Because I was a coward," Hyun-woo thought. "Because I believed I was protecting you by leaving. Because I didn't understand that strength isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about being present even when presence is terrifying. Because I've spent 3 years telling myself I made the right choice while slowly dying inside." But what he said was, "Because they exist. Because you shouldn't have to do this alone. Because I was wrong." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Naomi wiped her face roughly, fighting tears. People who've been hurt learn to protect themselves by expecting disappointment. Trust, once broken, requires more than words to rebuild. It requires consistency, presence, proof that this time will be different. Hyun-woo understood he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for the opportunity to earn it through action rather than promises. What are you offering? Naomi asked finally, her voice exhausted. Safety. Stability. Whatever you need to stay in Korea and raise them without worrying about money or immigration or anonymous complaints. I have resources. Let me use them. And what do you want in return? To know them. To be part of their lives, if you'll let me. Naomi studied him for a long moment, weighing possibilities, calculating risks. Finally, she nodded slowly. I need to think about it. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was the first step toward something neither of them could name yet. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that sometimes the hardest thing we can do is allow others to witness our vulnerability and hope they don't weaponize it against us. 3 days later, Naomi stood outside a traditional Hanok house in Bucheon, her triplets beside her, staring at what Hyun-woo had arranged. The property belonged to his family's portfolio. A guest house technically, though no guests had stayed there in years. It had been renovated with modern amenities while maintaining traditional architecture. Ondal heated floors, hanji paper doors, a small courtyard garden with a stone fountain. This is too much, Naomi said as Hyun-woo showed her through rooms filled with furniture, a kitchen stocked with groceries, bedrooms prepared for children with toys she hadn't bought. I can't accept this. You're not accepting it for yourself, Hyun-woo replied, watching Kai. He'd learned their names from the research file, explore the courtyard with wide eyes. You're accepting it for them. They need stability. This provides it. The logic was irrefutable, even if the situation felt impossible. Naomi had spent 3 years building walls against the memory of him, teaching herself that independence meant never needing anyone, especially not someone who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. But those walls were theoretical constructs. The reality standing in front of her was 3 children who deserved the kind of security she couldn't provide alone, no matter how hard she worked. There are conditions, she said firmly. You don't get to just show up whenever you want. We establish boundaries. I make decisions about their welfare. And if you hurt them the way you hurt me, I will make sure you regret it. Understood. They established a routine over the following weeks. Hyun-woo visited 3 afternoons a week, scheduled in advance, always respecting the boundaries Naomi set. He didn't try to force connection with the children. Instead, he sat quietly in the courtyard while they played, letting them become accustomed to his presence. June, the most outgoing, approached him first, offering a toy truck with the kind of casual trust that only children possess. Mina followed, more cautious but curious. Kai remained distant, watching from his mother's side with ancient eyes that suggested he understood more than a 3-year-old should. Hyun-woo had expected fatherhood to be a role he performed, another mask to wear alongside the enforcer, the son, the fiancé. What he discovered instead was that children don't accept performances. They demand authenticity. When June asked why Hyun-woo's hands had scars, there was no lie sophisticated enough to satisfy a toddler's curiosity. When Mina woke from a nightmare and found Hyun-woo reading in the living room, his presence either helped or it didn't. There was no middle ground. When Kai finally approached him with a Korean children's book and asked him to read it, Hyun-woo realized that the child had been testing him, watching to see if he'd stay or leave like promises often did. Reading to Kai became their ritual. The boy had a remarkable ability to focus, absorbing vocabulary and pronunciation with startling speed. Hyun-woo taught him simple Korean phrases, and Kai repeated them with perfect intonation, his serious face concentrating on each sound. These moments, sitting on the floor with his son pressed against his side, patiently explaining the meaning of words, felt more real than anything Hyun-woo had experienced in his violent life. But reality had a way of intruding. One evening, as Hyun-woo was leaving, Naomi stopped him at the door. We need to talk about your family. He'd been waiting for this conversation. What do you want to know? Everything. Because if you're going to be in their lives, I need to understand what that means. What'd you actually do? What kind of danger you bring with you? They sat in the courtyard after the children were asleep, and Hyun-woo told her truths he'd never shared with anyone outside the organization. He explained the structure of Korean organized crime, the complex hierarchy, the code of loyalty, the way violence was both business and culture. He described his role, the things he'd done, the person he'd become in service to his family's empire. He didn't soften it or excuse it. He laid out the reality of who he was with clinical honesty because she'd asked for the truth, and truth was the only currency that mattered now. Naomi listened without interruption, her face unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she asked, "Why did you really leave me?" "Because I just killed a child," Hyun-woo said simply. 6 years old. My father ordered it. I carried it out. And then I came home to you, and you smiled at me like I was someone worth loving. I couldn't reconcile those things. I thought if you knew what I was capable of, it would destroy you. So I destroyed us instead. That was my choice to make, Naomi said, her voice steady. You decided what I could handle. You made yourself the authority on my own capacity for understanding. That's not protection, Hyun-woo. That's control. The words hit him like physical blows because they were true. He'd convinced himself he was being noble, sacrificing his happiness for her safety. But nobility would have meant trusting her with the truth and letting her decide if she could love someone like him. Instead, he'd made the choice for her, taking away her agency in the name of keeping her safe. It was the same paternalistic instinct that made him effective in his criminal role. The certainty that he knew better, that his judgment superseded others' autonomy. You're right, he acknowledged. I was wrong about that too. Naomi studied him in the moonlight, this complicated man who'd given her the best and worst experiences of her life. I'm telling you this now, so it's clear. If you're going to be their father, you can't be half in. They need all of you or none of you. No more running when things get difficult. No more deciding for us what we can handle. You stay and face whatever comes, or you leave now before they get attached. The choice she was offering was the same one he'd faced 3 years ago. Stay and risk the consequences, or leave to avoid them. This time, what had changed wasn't the external circumstances. What had changed was Hyun-woo's understanding of what courage actually required. Running from danger to protect people you loved felt like strength. Staying present even when presence meant vulnerability, even when you couldn't control the outcome, even when others might judge your past, that was the harder thing. That was what his children needed to learn from him, the one lesson worth teaching. That being human meant staying in the mess, not fleeing from it. I'm staying, Hyun-woo said. Whatever that costs. Naomi nodded slowly, and something in her expression softened fractionally. Trust wasn't restored by grand gestures. It was rebuilt through consistency, through showing up again and again, through proving that this time, the words matched the actions. They were at the beginning of that process, not the end. But beginnings, Hyun-woo was learning, were their own kind of courage. The crisis came 6 weeks after Hyun-woo had started visiting regularly. He arrived at the Hangang to find Naomi pale-faced and shaking, an official letter clutched in her hands. Immigration services had denied her visa renewal. She had 30 days to leave the country. The children, as Korean citizens through birth, could stay, but without a legal guardian present, they'd enter state care until arrangements could be made. They're taking them, Naomi said, her voice hollow with shock. If I leave, they take my children. Hyun-woo read the letter, his mind immediately calculating possibilities, loopholes, solutions. But the bureaucratic language was clear and designed to be inescapable. Someone had systematically built a case against her. Unauthorized work, failure to maintain proper documentation, insufficient financial resources. Every minor violation had been documented and weaponized. He pulled out his phone and called Jin-ho. I need a meeting with my father. Tonight. The Lee family compound occupied 3 acres in Songbuk-dong, a fortress disguised as a traditional estate. Hyun-woo walked through security checkpoints staffed by men who'd known him since childhood, entering the main house where his father held court every evening. Lee Sang-min sat in his study, reviewing ledgers with the same meticulous attention he'd applied to building his criminal empire from nothing. You've been neglecting your duties, Sang-min said without looking up. Your fiancé's family is asking questions. They wonder if the alliance still matters to you. We need to talk about Naomi Wells. Now his father looked up, his expression neutral. The American with your children. Yes, I'm aware. You filed the immigration complaints. I resolved a complication that threatened our family's reputation and your strategic marriage. You should thank me for handling it discreetly. Hyun-woo had grown up watching his father operate with this kind of cold calculation, valuing strategy over humanity, tradition over adaptation. He'd learned to think the same way, to see people as pieces to be moved or removed depending on their usefulness. But standing here, knowing that his children would be taken from their mother because of this worldview, Hyun-woo understood that some legacies needed to be broken rather than continued. Those children are your grandchildren, Hyun-woo said quietly. Those children are evidence of your weakness, Sang-min corrected. You allowed emotion to compromise your judgment. You involved yourself with someone unsuitable. Now you want to compound that mistake by legitimizing it. I won't allow you to dishonor this family. Then I'm leaving. The words fell into silence. Sang-min's expression didn't change, but his stillness became absolute. In their world, leaving the family didn't mean resignation. It meant exile. It meant becoming a target. It meant losing protection, resources, identity, everything that defined who you were. If you walk away from this family, you walk away from everything, Sang-min said. Your accounts will be frozen. Your position will be given to your brother. The properties in your name will be reclaimed. And if you become a liability, you'll be handled like any other liability. I understand. Do you? His father stood, approaching him with the kind of predatory focus that had made him legendary. You think you can just become a different person? Start over? You've done terrible things in service to this family. That doesn't disappear because you decided to play father. You'll always be what we made you. Maybe that was true. Maybe the violence Hyun-woo had committed was permanent, carved into his soul like scars. But he'd also learned that people weren't singular things. They were collections of contradictions, capable of both profound cruelty and startling tenderness. The man who'd executed his father's orders and the man who read bedtime stories to his son could exist in the same body. The question wasn't whether he could erase his past. The question was whether he could choose differently going forward. I'm what you made me, Hyun-woo agreed. But they don't have to be. They can be better. And I can at least try to show them how. He walked out of his father's study, out of the compound, out of the only life he'd ever known. Jin-ho was waiting by the car, his expression carefully neutral. You're really doing this, Jin-ho said. Not a question. I am. You know they'll come after you eventually. Your father doesn't forgive defection. Eventually isn't today. Today, I need to figure out how to keep 3 children with their mother. The solution came from an unexpected source. Hyun-woo's marriage to Min-ji had been arranged, but his potential marriage to Naomi could be authentic. A Korean citizen married to a foreign national provided visa protection and legal guardianship rights. It was transactional in its logistics, but rooted in something real. The question was whether Naomi would see it as another manipulation or as what it actually was, a man trying to use the only tools he had to protect his family. He proposed that night in the courtyard, the children asleep inside, the weight of his decision settling over everything. He didn't offer grand declarations or promises of love. He offered practicality, a solution to an immediate crisis, a legal structure to protect them, his name, and whatever resources he could salvage from his exit. This doesn't fix everything, Naomi said, staring at the simple gold band he'd bought. It doesn't erase what happened. I know, and I don't trust you yet. That's going to take time. I know that too. But those children need stability more than I need pride. She took the ring, turned it over in her fingers. So yes, but understand this, Hyun-woo, you're choosing us every single day, or you're choosing nothing. There's no middle ground anymore. He understood. The old version of himself had tried to exist in middle grounds, to compartmentalize his life into sections that didn't touch. The new reality was simpler and more demanding. Every morning, he'd wake up and choose to be present. Every evening, he'd return having chosen them over the countless other paths his life could have taken. That was what fatherhood meant, what partnership meant, what redemption required. Not a singular dramatic moment, but 1,000 small decisions repeated until they became who you were. 6 months later, Hyun-woo stood in the courtyard watching Kai teach his brother's Korean vocabulary while Naomi prepared dinner. He'd found legitimate work as a security consultant, using his expertise in ways that didn't require violence. His family had indeed frozen his accounts and reclaimed properties, but he'd anticipated that and secured enough resources to rebuild. His brother sent occasional messages, veiled threats, reminders of what he'd abandoned. His father sent nothing at all, which was perhaps the clearest message of all. But here, in this small hammock with its garden and its noise and its mundane domestic chaos, Hyun-woo had found something his father's empire could never provide, a reason to be better than what he'd been made to be. The children called him Appa now, that simple Korean word for father that carried the weight of responsibility and trust. Naomi had started smiling at him again, cautiously but genuinely, building something new from the ruins of what they'd once had. He'd spent his entire life believing strength meant control. That power came from the capacity to make others fear you. What he'd learned instead was that real courage meant standing still when every instinct screamed to run. It meant letting people see you completely and trusting they wouldn't use that vulnerability as a weapon. It meant choosing connection over protection, presence over safety, the terrifying uncertainty of love over the cold certainty of isolation. The lesson had cost him everything he'd thought he wanted. But watching his daughter laugh as her brother mispronounced a Korean word, seeing Naomi glance at him with something that might someday become forgiveness, Hyun-woo understood that what he'd gained was infinitely more valuable than what he'd lost. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be ordinary, let yourself need others, let yourself believe that being known is more important than being feared. That evening, as they ate dinner together, June asked him to tell a story. Hyun-woo hesitated, then began speaking about a man who'd lost his way and found it again through the unexpected gift of second chances. He didn't mention that the man was him. He didn't need to. The children listened with wide eyes, absorbing the implicit message that people could change, that mistakes weren't permanent, that love was always stronger than fear if you were brave enough to let it be. When he finished, Naomi reached across the table and took his hand. Not forgiveness yet, maybe, but acceptance. Recognition that he was trying, that the trying mattered, that they were building something together from honest foundations this time. And in that moment, Hyun-woo felt something he'd never experienced in his father's empire: peace. The quiet, unremarkable peace of being exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the people who mattered, living exactly the life he'd been too afraid to choose until fear became less powerful than love.